I've known her way back 20 years or so. And she's the International Action Center, been long associated with that icon of justice, Ramsey Clark. And they've got the International Action Center. And she's going to be talking particularly about Libya, I would think, because she's been following that issue and it's very much in the air in terms of the international order. So without further ado, you okay? You got some questions? Let's welcome them, okay? Sara Flounders, she's going to talk to us, and so let's give her a good welcome. You can just start talking, sir.
Okay, and hopefully this will be an evening where we have a lot of discussion and back and forth.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Do I need to be hooked to anything?
No.
I'm okay here. All right. All right. At any rate, hopefully this will be an evening with a lot of discussion and back and forth, but really addressing the U.S. Latest war, the war in Libya, at a time of unprecedented global crisis and an absolutely unsolvable crisis right here in the U.S. with unemployment figures that are the highest in 3 generations and no end in sight, and jobless figures which again, went up, of a housing crisis that goes on, of a crisis on every level, and at the same time, we again and again hear that it will get worse, not that the chances of economic recovery are faint to non-existent.
Keep talking. Just keep
Okay.
talking.
All right. Coming into this again and again is a new U.S. war and other wars immediately on the horizon. We're now at the 90th day of the NATO bombardment of Libya, more than 12,000 bombing sorties. Now, this is a war that at first they expected would not last more than a few days. And as a matter of fact, when on March 17th, the UN Security Council passed this, quote, humanitarian resolution, which was total propaganda from the get-go, and we should go into that. But when they passed it, that very evening, French jets took off. They were so anxious to be the ones responsible for winding this up quickly, and absolutely expected the government of Libya to collapse immediately. When that didn't happen, that was actually March 19th. When that did not happen within a week, they were really, British and French forces were forced to turn to NATO, which is a U.S. commanded military alliance, for their strategic backup. And NATO is really an alliance that is more than 75% funded by the U.S. It's an entirely a U.S. Commanded and equipped military alliance, or military machine. So NATO came into this on March 27th with a 90-day limit on their military operation. Of course, they've since extended that in an open-ended extension. They're saying till September, till however long it takes. But you see, this is a military engagement that we were first told would be days, and we're into and well past 90 days. We're well past the 60-day limit of the U.S. War Powers Act, which Congress went out of their way in a resolution on Friday, but also several weeks before, to remind President Obama about. And they actually passed 2 votes, which are probably, would be hard to find a more hypocritical, duplicitous, speaking out of both sides of your mouth vote in Congress in the recent period. Because the first vote, which passed by 3/4, was against the war in Libya in terms of the War Powers Act and insisting that President Obama consult with Congress. And then an hour later, they passed by almost similar numbers at this time passing, a vote funding the military operation. So it means that all these congresspeople have in their back pocket a resolution where they can say, oh, I voted against the war. But of course, on the other hand, they very much voted for the war. Now, not to be outdone by duplicitous and two-sided politics, we should just look at the fact that President Obama, 2 days before, gave a speech, and in that speech he talked about a big troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. When President Obama came into office, there were 30,000 troops in Afghanistan, and now there are more than 100,000, plus 100,000 contractors, and about 50,000 NATO and other collaborators in the military operation. So you have 250,000 troops, and the big withdrawal announcement was for 10,000 troops this year, perhaps another 20,000 next year. So you see, in total numbers, they're talking about a very, very small 10–15% withdrawal of troops. Not a withdrawal at all, really just a repositioning. And at the same time, really talking about how more of this war will be war by drones. In other words, war where there aren't U.S. casualties, and there guaranteed there aren't to be civilian casualties. Now, excuse me, there's an echo.
No, we're checking the stream. It's now going okay. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Now, just in terms of the war in Libya, because it's important to look at the excuses, the apologies, the propaganda for the war as being a war to save lives, a war for humanitarian aims, and what that really means. Because when you're dropping bombs on people, that's not in any way saving lives, of course. And the casualties have been non-stop and completely disregarded by the news media here. They'll report that Libya claims that there have been civilian casualties, and then they'll just disregard it. They'll say, well, of course, these are only military targets. So this war on Libya, its destruction is not only in the civilian casualties, its destruction is in the infrastructure, extremely modern infrastructure that Libya had built up in a very short span of time, which completely transformed life in Libya from having one of the lowest standards of education, of health care in the entire Mediterranean region, to what is today, what before U.S. bombardment was the highest standards in terms of quality of life, length of life, low childhood mortality rates, literacy, especially literacy for women, and so on, of any country in Africa. And this is what is being consciously and determinedly destroyed. And destroyed because there is a determination on the part of U.S. military contractors, U.S. military corporations, and industrial corporations, and oil corporations, to control the oil and the resources of Libya, and at the same time, this can only be accomplished by ruining so much of the infrastructure that people are left destitute. I think we've very much seen this in Iraq, where you had a country that had the highest standards within the entire Arab world. What was a secular government with high educational standards and health standards and so on. And you have a country where now a third of the population is dead, disabled, or dislocated. Now that is a Holocaust for any population. And that is what U.S. war on Iraq has done. U.S. war in Afghanistan has been even more destructive, because you had a country that was already one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth, and conditions have become absolutely worse. So you can picture the horror that they have in store for Libya has nothing to do with a humanitarian mission. It has a great deal to do with trying to push back what's called the Arab Spring, the uprising in Egypt and Tunisia, and to consciously, by a U.S. military operation, again create fear in the region and a huge U.S. footprint that turns the whole struggle around. And you could only look at the difference between the U.S. approach toward Libya, and we might also, I think we should also actually include Syria in this, where there's a U.S. destabilization very much underway, where another country, both Libya and Syria, under U.S. sanctions for years, under constant hostile U.S. threats. Syria certainly under continuing unending Israeli threats. Part of Syria actually occupied still to this day, over the Golan Heights. Both countries very much targeted, and at the same time we're told that there's a great concern for democracy. And you could compare that to the U.S. attitude in Bahrain, to the U.S. attitude in Yemen, where there have been enormous uprisings that have gone on month after month, both of them now in the fourth month. And what is the U.S. doing in Yemen? They're firing drones again and again and again, while at the same time saying, well, they hope for democracy, but doing nothing except to back up Saudi intervention in Bahrain and, as I say, drones in Yemen. So the idea that there's any interest in democracy by the U.S. in the region, it is really what can they do to destabilize and actually destroy regimes where they felt they didn't have free and open and complete control and access. And there's no country, there's no government in the world that is perfect. So I don't think we need to idealize Libya or Syria or any government that is under U.S. attack. But we should know that the attacks are not meant to improve, the standard of living or the quality of democracy and or human rights in any country that the U.S. is targeting. It's all really how to take advantage and how to sow chaos, discord, destabilization in order to return the entire population to being day workers for the empire at the lowest absolute level. This is completely the intention. Now, I want to also connect it because we had a very interesting action today down at in front of City Hall, where there's been a 2-week encampment going on by some very courageous and determined, mainly young people, homeless activists and union activists, against the New York City budget. Now, in New York City at this point, they are actually the mayor talked about cutting far more teachers, about 5,000 teachers, than he actually expected to. It's sort of like a negotiation. He promised much worse than we were expecting. But at the same time, it was a plan to cut thousands of people off of accessible daycare, to give vouchers that are now worth half what they were before for daycare. It used to be a daycare voucher for a family, impoverished family, was $4,700. It will now be $2,200. Where did the family get $50 a week to cover the daycare? A voucher that wasn't even complete coverage. Cuts in senior centers. Cuts in of course, in the CUNY schools, and increases in tuition, school closings, fire closings, library closings. This is in a city that has no deficit. Think about that. There's absolutely no reason to be cutting the budget, except that that is what is happening across the country where every single social program is under attack, and the only sacred cow, the only thing that can only grow and be fed is the military budget. It goes up every single year, at least 10 to 15%, and when you add in all the other supplemental expenses, it's even more. So you have a budget which is larger, military budget that's larger than the whole rest of the world combined. And now, educational and health standards in the U.S. are about the lowest in the industrialized world. I mean, think about it. A third of the children in the U.S. today do not graduate high school. Don't graduate high school. The staggering figures. The figures on life expectancy in about 2/3 of the counties in New York are lower than El Salvador and a number of countries in Latin America. The figures on infant mortality are actually lower than several countries within this hemisphere. Cuba now having actually the most impressive standards. So here's a very rich, the richest country in the world with the largest military budget and actually deteriorating standards. The highest rate of imprisonment in the entire planet is right here. And we can just never forget that. About 10 times higher than other industrialized countries, the prison population right here in the U.S. There's now 2.4 million people in prison, and even more when you count immigrant workers, when you count youthful offenders, when you count probation and parole and all of those figures. It's a tremendously high incarceration. This is also a real byproduct of the military budget, of no money spent on after-school programs, on drug programs, on educational programs, on millions of youth with no future, and all of the money going not only to the military, it goes to things like the New York Police Department and police departments across the country who enforce. It's another hand of militarism, is that the repression comes back here, a much larger police state. You have stop and frisk rules in New York City where really overwhelmingly 60–70% of Black and Latino youth stopped and frisked again and again and again, pulled in on the smallest offenses, fingerprinted on a routine basis. This is another part of the military budget. It's another part of war in Libya, it's another part of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, drone attacks. It's sort of looking at it in the whole picture. I just want to bring into this discussion also because sometimes when we're thinking about the military budget and the prisons, people say, well, you know, that's just throwing all kinds of things into the soup here. How do they connect? But to give one example, I thought this was really important. The startling number of U.S. weapons that are now made by prison labor, earning 23 cents an hour. Unicorn is a corporation that makes, and all sorts of things, Patriot missiles, all kinds of pieces of tanks, electronic pieces, and whatnot, are now made in U.S. federal prisons. U.S. state prisons advertise to the biggest corporations in the world that you could get the cheapest labor rates that you could get in any country in the world, right here. And you have less shipping costs. They actually run callous advertisements like this, where there's no health and safety standards that are implemented. So it's another aspect of the wars coming back here. A larger military, more aggressive, and more determined to attack the unions here. For so long we were told, well, all these weapon systems, you know, they make good jobs. They make good jobs at Boeing and this and that. But they actually, when far fewer jobs. There's about 5 times more jobs if you put the same amount of money into infrastructure and social needs versus the military budget. So all of these things together are completely both distorting life here and completely destroying countries around the world who had attempted any form of independent development. Now, what was Libya's crime? It's important to ask, why was it really in the crosshairs of the U.S., even though they had complied, especially after seeing shock and awe and the devastation of Iraq. Libya did try to reach some accommodation. They actually, it's like putting a gun to someone's head and saying, plead guilty. They pled guilty to the Lockerbie. They agreed to a compensation. They agreed to IMF conditions to end subsidies, privatize all the different industries. It was really a deal at a gun to your head. You either face shock and awe, or what we just did to Iraq, or you reach an immediate accommodation. And so there was a time of accommodation. Libya agreed to many of the U.S. and IMF World Bank demands. And for that, they were roundly applauded. Muammar Gaddafi was hosted throughout Europe. Suddenly, Geneva Human Rights Commission wanted to write a glowing report as to actually how wonderful conditions in Libya were. And actually, that was to be released just the week after it was scheduled for release. The U.S. war on Libya began. So it meant that they sent out the message: if you play ball our way, we're willing to rewrite history. Now, it's important to recognize that even while there were many conditions that Libya agreed to, as far as the U.S. was concerned, it was never enough. And if they could possibly do anything that would open a wedge, they were more than willing to do it. And what's called an opposition in Benghazi, it's a totally different social movement than the movement in Tahrir Square in Cairo, or the movement that broke out across Egypt, which was millions and millions of people. Egypt desperately poor, 85 million, 90 million, I'm trying to think of the exact population of Egypt today. I think 90 million?
Around there.
$2 a day, more than the majority of the population living on. Desperate poverty in Egypt, and you had an uprising that was in the millions that actually pushed Mubarak down. Now, the movement in Libya was totally different from that. It was a small group in Benghazi who, with armed forces, and this was, as they themselves proclaim, the Libyan Salvation Front is a group that the U.S. CIA had maintained on the Egyptian-Libyan border, like a Contra force, for decades. There were also Libyan monarchists. That doesn't mean that there weren't any forces, any young forces caught up in this who identified with Egypt, but overwhelmingly the leadership were forces that wanted to take Libya back to the old ways, and were willing to ally themselves with the United States and the European imperialists, with the old colonial powers, in order to come into power, and willing to sign any deal. What, as I say, what had Libya done, even though it had agreed to many concessions from the West? They had continued to invest in Africa. And that is a crime that the U.S. and the British and the French could not tolerate. It was Libyan funds that built a satellite system that made telecommunications throughout Africa affordable. Before that time, everything had to, every phone call, everything had to go through Europe, prohibitively expensive. Libya, by funding, putting up a satellite, changed all of that around. One of the biggest changes was Libya was trying to help develop an African currency and back it up with their quite substantial little cash reserves. Now, what did the U.S. want done with huge Libyan cash reserves? About $75 billion.
Yeah.
It'd be fine if they just deposited in Chase Bank and Goldman Sachs. There would have been no trouble. But the fact instead that they wanted to invest it in an African currency, particularly the French imperialists felt the threat of that to the French African franc. It would have completely collapsed that, which gives France great power, investment power throughout Africa. So I'm touching on a lot of things that why Libya particularly was targeted, the next in line after Iraq, why we should also realize that Syria today is very much targeted, and why at the same time we should realize that those who are U.S. pawns in the region, such as Bahrain and Yemen, aren't going to be sanctioned or bombed. It's the opposition forces who face the drone attacks. And any time I speak anywhere, I always say to people here, we really have to be aware of how much these wars do come on us. So with that, let me kind of open it up for a discussion from folks here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Bob Gums, and I'm not curious. I would classify myself more as in search of knowledge. Now, I've had the opportunity of being attacked by Libya twice. I was in the Navy, and I was in the Navy under Jimmy Carter, and I was in the Navy under Ronald Reagan and George Bush. I'm sure you're familiar with the Gulf of Sidra incident. I was there, okay? And we were, to me, any reasonable person's mind, we were in Libyan territorial waters. Now, I have a couple of other questions besides, and that is number one, did Gaddafi, did he or did he not, order the bombing that killed the GIs in Germany, and was he responsible for Lockerbie, in your opinion?
Not only in my opinion, but in the opinion of quite a number of commentators, Libya was not in any way responsible. And as a matter of fact, the U.S. first tried to pin it on Syria, tried to pin it on several Palestinian groups, and it was sort of a shifting target as to who would take the blame, who of U.S. different enemies at the time would take the blame.
Okay, so you don't think that Libya was responsible for either one?
No.
What put the U.S. and Libya on this collision course from the jump street?
Well, I think the big thing is Libya has the largest concentration of oil in Africa, and extremely high quality oil, very excellent for export, needing little refining, and strategically just across the Mediterranean from its major markets. That makes Libya enormously attractive. Also, Libya, in trying to reach an accommodation with the West, actually disarmed. And so it's like saying to thieves and robbers, here's my gun, but can I keep my wallet? As soon as Libya disarmed, they had no way of saying, let's be friends. And so, having an enormous amount in both oil, in oil reserves, and in actual cash reserves, billions of dollars, made them an enormously attractive target for major corporations who want to seize hold of that.
Well, you might be interested to know that out of my 11 years in the Navy, I spent 4, when I wasn't at sea duty, I spent 4 at the Pentagon, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, doing top secret work. And I saw a lot. Libya was kind of a funny country because you always in traffic and in the basically in the outlines that were written up, you saw a lot of, blame cast. But, no one ever really came across with any evidence. And I think the big secret is, and this is a secret as far as the average American is concerned, is that the biggest nut in Americans' intelligence community that remains yet to be cracked is Africa. Because, as you say, there is if we went into Africa, Africa could literally cure everything that ails the planet right now. And my other question is, the Europeans are supposedly, anti-war, peace-loving. Every time I've been in Europe, I've always had intelligent, good conversations with folks. I'm planning to move there if the Republicans take over next year. What, gives NATO the cojones to suddenly, they're doing a lousy job of it, but what gives them the cojones to just basically take the lead on this whole NATO thing? That's the first question.
Okay.
And my last question is this. I'm also a volunteer for the Obama campaign. I am very upset with a lot of the things that he has done and has not done over these last 3 years. But I think it would be morally wrong of me to essentially sit back and let Michelle Bachmann and that clown from Texas get in the White House. And I think the best thing we can do is to keep pressure on not only on Obama, but on our Democrats in Congress to basically, come to their senses about these crazy foreign policy schemes. So if we can handle all that, I appreciate it.
Well, let me just say with Obama, because the Obama election was, historically an extremely important election for the U.S. And for millions of white workers, it was a statement against racism and a hope for change. For millions of black workers, it was like long overdue and absolutely heartfelt. The problem with the U.S. political system is it really matters little who's in office, because who's in control, no matter how you cut it, is Wall Street, and particularly the military and oil corporations. That is who runs the system, and truly they set the agenda.
Now, when you say military, you don't mean us guys.
No,
my little sailor suit.
No. I mean,
or even my skipper on the Nimitz,
The very ability of the system to profit every step. Yes, this is.
Why don't you hold it up and show it in the Wall Street Journal? Hold it up.
This is,
Come
yeah.
in on this. This is different from the Wall Street Journal where they're superimposing
They're really morphing
Bush.
Obama and Bush. The
It's
policies
one-
haven't changed.
Hold it for the camera and
Okay.
see they get it. It's just an interesting thing. They morph others too. But that's interesting. They call it duopoly.
that's frightening.
Yeah.
And it's true because regardless of who the individual is in office, and even the importance of the election, it doesn't change the system itself, and who runs it and who profits from it. When they say that there are 200 billionaires who own more than 2 billion people in the world today, and most of them are in the U.S., it's a tiny handful who really, really benefit from this system the way it's presently organized.
Suppose he just woke up tomorrow morning and told Hillary, look, lady, go take a hike. We're not helping NATO in Libya. To hell with you. Because she's the one that's been pushing for this. Suppose, he just did that.
Well, I don't think he or anyone in the administration is in a position to do that and survive. I mean, that is actually true that in one way or another the U.S. has not only assassination by gun, but assassination by reputation, assassination of being able to destroy politicians in 101 ways, making someone seem completely inept or deranged at a moment's notice just by the amount of coverage changing. The Obama policy is not set by Obama alone. And the Democratic Party is not much different than the Republican Party. It's a different social base in the electorate in the U.S. But in terms of who really they represent in the economy, in terms of corporate profit, they receive almost dollar for dollar, surprisingly, some of the same campaign contributions. The biggest corporations give to both because they intend to benefit regardless of who is in office. Now, and they set policy and also set the parameters in a way in which there's very little choice. Now, Obama or another political figure can be elected promising a withdrawal from Iraq and ending foreign wars and bringing jobs home and all of the things which Obama genuinely, and he may have believed he could carry this out. But you have a system that now feeds on and is totally addicted to war. And it is like asking a drug addict to be honorable when they absolutely have to have their fix in order to survive. And that fix is the huge super subsidies that are represented in the military contracts. And it's also the giveaway to the banks. The banks went through an economic meltdown. Well, there was no question of bailing out the average person's home or condo or apartment anywhere in the U.S. But they could give almost overnight $1 trillion to the banking system to keep them afloat. Huge subsidy. So you have welfare, super welfare for the super rich, and literally nothing here. And a system that's a contraction is more and more like crisis driven to give that money to those whose survival, the biggest corporate owners, their survival is at stake, and they will rob from everybody and do so at a moment's notice.
So
Now, just,
yeah, but
I just asked one other question on NATO, which I just wanted to address. What is NATO? NATO is a U.S. commanded and equipped military alliance. That means even every country in Europe, they have to buy U.S. arms. When Secretary of Defense Gates, he's on his way out, he makes his final honorary lap. What did he lecture Europe to do? He said, if you're going to take NATO seriously, you have to pay more money. What he really meant was more money to Boeing and to every one of the military contractors, Lockheed and so on. More money for us to equip NATO. It was pointing a gun to the Allies, saying, more ante-up if you want to be in on the recolonization of Africa. And I do very much agree with you that the greatest wealth, untapped wealth that the corporations are looking at today is in Africa. And a campaign that went on about, I forget if it was 5 or 8 years, to base AFRICOM in an African country. And they were turned down by every country in Africa.
Yeah, I was there at the start of that.
Okay, they're actually based in Frankfurt, Germany. AFRICOM based in Frankfurt, Germany. Think about that. Because no African country would have them. Now, what do I think they're looking at the Willis Air Force Base, which was the largest base at the time in Libya. And it was the young officers led by Muammar Gaddafi who demanded that that U.S. base be closed down. It's still, now it's a Libyan base, but it's a huge base, important for U.S. command efforts to control the Arab world, the Mediterranean, and Europe. And I think they see that as a future home for Africa.
Yeah, Bob, you got to let others talk. But one thing I just want to mention, you brought up Lockerbie. I want to let people know about a book, Trail of the Octopus. I don't know how people know it, how many people might know it, but it's a thing having to do with Lockerbie, which gets into that. It's a big issue because they use that to claim terrorism and so forth. But the Trail of the Octopus, published by Bloomsbury, The author is Donald Goddard, Goddard, with Lester K. Coleman. This is a book called On the Lockerbie Issue, okay? So we just wanted to let you know that. And so other people, Bob, let others talk. Somebody's got questions, others. I'm sorry to interfere, but this is a good book on Lockerbie. Okay.
I came from the rally at Park Road, Bloombergville rally, and I'm a member of UNAC and so on and so forth. Let me make some friendly suggestions that may sound critical, or some critical suggestions that, God forbid, may sound friendly. I don't think that the UNAC, which is United National Anti-War Committee, I don't think that UNAC is using the internet enough, or really at all. I get an occasional mailing about a demo tomorrow or next week or a month from now or whatever, but I'm not receiving any educational material. Okay? Now, when we're talking about Libya, I've been there also. I have a lot of criticisms of Libya, but I'm opposed to Obama. Well, I don't care what Gaddafi is doing. I completely agree with you as to what Obama is doing. Okay. But I think that UNAC should have a Libya page, on the internet devoted to Libya, where people can present documentation on what's going on in Libya, what about Gaddafi, what about the, quote, rebels, and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't want to get into a big thing about it now, but this is an article from the Wall Street Journal about Libya's gold balance, where they gave $1.3 billion to Goldman Sachs to play around with, some stocks and some currency things, etc. In other words, the Green Book was way back then. As we say, after 2003, he really tried to get in with the system. And that has to be a part of people's understanding of what's going on in Libya now. But let's take it a step further than that. One of the big events that's been happening and has been very well played up in the newspapers, I mean, I'm giving them credit for this, is the women's movement in Saudi Arabia. Okay? Now, I haven't seen UNAC even take a position on what's going on in Saudi Arabia. But what I have found is that as this has been developing, more and more stuff is appearing in places like the Wall Street Journal as to what is Saudi Arabia's role in the setting of oil prices. And they're the key, because they have so much oil that they can sell a lot of cheap oil where the other countries want to, keep the prices high as possible and so on and so forth. Now, the United States, Obama, just before the Arab Spring, made a deal with Saudi Arabia where the United States is going to sell $60 to $90 billion worth of weapons to the Saudi regime. Okay? Now, this was well before the spring, and they mumbled about, maybe we should reconsider it, but they ain't, because not only will they be getting money from Saudi Arabia from this, but this is what you might call stimulus to the economy here, since it is a militarized economy. Now, I would suggest that UNAC write up a petition, or call it what you will, on the rights of Saudi women, on the rights of Saudi people in general, etc., but particularly the focus on women, and send it to every women's organization in the United States to get them to sign it, etc., to make an issue out of it, etc. And again, to set up a Saudi Arabia page, where I've been collecting all kinds of information on the Saudi regime. And, let's put it this way. A government that arms the Saudi regime is as criminal as the Saudi regime in everybody's eyes. I mean, the New York Times, Maureen Dowd and people like her are saying, what the hell's going on here? I mean, look what's happening, etc. So I would say that a key to UNAC is, I'm all for street demonstrations and all that kind of stuff, but we gotta use the internet and educate people on country by country, America's role in Saudi Arabia, America's role in Libya, et cetera, you know, in Syria, et cetera, with background material on these countries, on these governments, et cetera, so that people will see UNAC as, oh, you want to know what's going on, you go to UNAC's website. And then from there you go to UNAC's demonstration. You get my
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just say, because the United National Anti-War League is first a coalition of forces from a wide range of perspectives. Leftists of different groupings, pacifists, anarchists, religious Muslim, religious Catholic forces, all different forces, who come together on agreement on particular action responses. Now, every one of the things you mentioned is already on the internet, and links to it are on the internet, and there are lots of access sites. Are they anywhere altogether? No. And maybe there should be a site that has a lot of this material. I know we try at the International Action Center, at IA Center, to post a great deal of material that we think is worthwhile. Is it everything? No. It's things that we think, given our perspective of always opposing U.S. imperialism and its plans, that we write up, research that we have, fact sheets, action proposals, links, and so on. If we were, as a coalition, to try to agree on everything that would go on an internet site, we'd never get anything done. So we really are determined to unite around actions that oppose U.S. wars, not to be a news service on all the very valuable information you mentioned. And I do think we need other websites that do that, programs that do that, and so on. But I don't think that can or should be asked of a coalition, because it's very difficult for a coalition to even accomplish agreeing on a common date and to get everybody out, and even several slogans. So what we agree on is to oppose U.S. intervention in any and every country, and not to be part of U.S. war demands and propaganda. That's like the bottom line. Do we agree on all other things in religion and the universe and so on? No. Nor are we trying to. So, anyway, I think that sort of explains it.
Just a quickie.
May I ask?
I would say that make a virtue out of the immense amount of differences within UNAC. If you have discussion pages where you have pro and con, then you can get by that.
Okay, maybe, but I will tell you, for the very busy people, and also where there may not be agreement on all of this, we can agree. There are all different views on the opposition in Libya, in Syria, in many countries, and there are all different views on the regimes themselves. Coming from all different directions, coming from Arab and Pan-African. I'm just saying to you that if you want a coalition that unites, it has to be around certain things which it says this will fight on, and recognizing that there are different views that we respect, different Arab and Muslim and African and pacifist and so on. There's Marxist interpretations that really look at imperialism as a system. That's how I see it. So, but there are others that may not take it from that perspective. So anyway, it's an idea, and there are many places to research things on the internet. Having links to struggles is important, but trying to put it all there under one coalition, I just can't picture that. So let me take back here.
Yeah. Speak up for the microphone, please.
Number one,
Speak loudly.
firstly and foremost, I welcome you, Karen,
Yes.
to the loft. I thank you so much for coming and sharing it with us. Now, I've got a huge scroll, and if you can stay here until about 4 in the morning, I could be able possibly to ask you, with your largesse of knowledge, certain questions. You've incited so many questions that is curious. Number one, American position. I flip back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was the first dynamic of don't touch America. We will not go out and touch anybody else. Monroe Doctrine. Protect our shores. And then secondly, in Jefferson's presidency, he sent the Army out, the Navy out to do the Barbary in Libya.
Right.
Rolling further in time backward, Libya was considered the breadbasket of Rome. It was a considerable, absolute gem of production for foodstuffs, which is what we require to live. And it has always been occupied by whoever comes from the left, from the right, from the south, from the north, whatever. It was always a jewel because of what it was. For what was required in those times, foodstuffs. Now it's required for oil stuffs. No. All. No. Because the industrial nations cannot figure out how not to use carbon systems for energy recreation, or the patent offices are filled with that are squelched because the oil barons want to do what they want to do, which is to garner. Now, you said so many magnificent points in your discussion. Yeah. I can't give you enough questions that I would.
Well, let me take, because you raised an important point, which before you go on, I don't want to forget it. And then we'll come back to your next. But let's look at all the way back at the Monroe Doctrine, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because that is really an example of how, from the very founding of the U.S., which was a system founded on slavery
And trade.
and the genocide of the native people, and the most aggressive form of both the slave trade and the huge plantation systems that had to do with the Caribbean. When you think of even who had the vote from the earliest days, it was a tiny minority of the population.
It was only landowners.
It was landowners, right, because indentured whites had no vote, of course, women had no votes, black people had no votes, native people had no votes, and many, many poor whites also had absolutely no votes. But the Monroe Doctrine was saying to Europe that we declare hands off this entire hemisphere.
That's right.
Not just the United States. It was saying that we declare the right to exploit all of the Caribbean and Latin America. And it was
take
really
on that word exploit? as opposed
to exploit.
protect.
In other words, to extract from the profit. And from the earliest days, one of the first sanctions that the U.S., the first sanctions that the U.S. ever imposed was on Haiti. The Great Haitian Revolution, the world's first successful slave revolution, 1804, and it was Jefferson who imposed sanctions that lasted right up until the Civil War, right up until the end of slavery in the U.S. And
What was the
starved
nature of the
Haiti
sanction?
down.
What was the nature of the sanction?
The nature of the sanctions was to stop any ship, not only U.S. ship, but French, British, all ships were to not dock in Haiti whatsoever. In other words, to cut Haiti off from the world, from trade, from every form. The Haitian people literally were forced to burn down their forests. It was once the jewel. It was once considered the Kuwait of the world, of the Caribbean, the richest. You know, there was Napoleon willing to sell all of Louisiana, what was called the Louisiana Purchase, in order to raise the arms to go and try to reconquer Haiti. We should even know that Britain, in their efforts to conquer Haiti after the French didn't succeed, lost more British troops in Haiti than they lost in the American Revolution.
No kidding. No,
So Haiti was very, very important because its sugar plantations, which were a source of great wealth at that age, for sugar, for rum, which was a real trade commodity. So I'm saying all this because from the earliest days, U.S. as a capitalist system based always on how to expand profit for the land-owning class. Now, that's a time when there were also many small landowners who could actually themselves benefit from the theft of native land and from world trade as it existed at that time. But as it has grown over the years, one thing about capitalism is that the capitalist class shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. It develops into a monopoly stage as wealth is concentrated and concentrated. That's how you have a system that was once, you know, many hundreds of thousands of owners, and now we say 200 billionaires owning more than 2 billion of the world's people. So as property and wealth is more and more concentrated in fewer hands over the course of the last couple hundred years, and a few U.S. corporations and banks today have the dominant influence. Now, that doesn't mean there's no one else that owns anything, but the gap between rich and poor has also grown to a larger gap than at any time in human history.
Yeah.
Larger than the pharaohs of Egypt, larger than the French Revolution, larger than at any time in human history between the super wealthy, the multi-billionaires, and millions of people who are, you can't say they own anything. They're in debt. They're in debt up to here and drowning. They have negative wealth. They have debt. That is the situation of the average person in the U.S. today, and the average person on the planet is living in debt that they have no way of ever repaying. So that's the system today.
With countries as well.
That's right. That is absolutely good, very good point. It is with countries, the indebtedness of entire countries. It makes a system.
Did you read Barron's yesterday?
Pardon?
Did you read Barron's?
Probably not.
Yesterday?
Barron's. Did you read Barron's
No, I
yesterday?
Front page article shows a supersonic military jet out of China. Now, forgive me for being personal in my education, but I was schooled in liberal arts for East-West studies, China, India, America, etc., etc. And the big question that our professors asked, because there are half Chinese specialists, half India specialists, and a few of those New Englanders, and who is going to surmount?
Yeah, where's it going?
And it was curious. Technology was going to go to India, force was going to go to China. And Barron's had a display of the new fighter rocket flying machine that they have just produced. Now you got billions.
I'd be very interested in looking at that, because it is true. There's what they call the Chinese model of development and the Indian model of development.
No. And there's one thing that is historically, excuse me for occupying.
No, there's a man over here who had his hand up.
Yeah.
For one curious reason, everybody wants access to the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And Russia doesn't have it, that's why that's Afghan wars. China doesn't have it, that's why now they're giving money to build Chinese ports in Karachi, in Colombo, and in the Gulf of Morocco. So they can have traders, their trading ships go there, and also protection, and also fighting ability, etc., etc. And it is extraordinary, the force that China has right now coming out of its communist, imperial communist, etc., etc.
Well, just actually on that point, then I'm going to take this man.
Yeah, we're going to
here.
take it.
But on that point, about 80% of the fuel, the energy, and the market sales that all of East Asia needs, which includes China, it includes South Korea, it includes what we call the Asian tigers and so on, but especially China, passes through the Straits of Malacca.
Yep.
And it is the Pentagon that is determined to control those straits and to try to
So are
cut
the
off
Japanese.
any of China's access, and Japan, yes. It is part of a real rivalry for global control. And
Absolutely.
here in the U.S., we should just never lose sight of the U.S. military machine, which is larger than the rest of the world combined, 10 times the size of China's military.
But Sarah, I want to leave
So let me
you.
Well,
try to
wait.
call on this guy.
No, last question.
No, well, quick.
Remember the force of the Praetorian Guard.
Okay.
Okay, there was a question here. Was it you that had it? What was the
Yeah, I
question?
was wanting you to expound upon the gap between the wealthy and the not so wealthy, and
A little louder.
why it is like understood to be defined as the largest gap. Because I haven't ever come across that analogy that it like for sure is the largest gap.
Yeah,
In
there-
history, yeah.